All.
Well, hello again. Peter Saturday from Universal Dork. I'm back again today to talk about this band right here because I gave this 2013 Punk Rockumentary a rewatch because I was lucky enough to go about a week and a half ago to see the Descendents live in Portland, Oregon at this event called Punk in the Park. And I'm quite happy to report that the Descendents are still on top of their game. They have not missed a beat. And I always love it when older bands like this are able to take the stage and deliver the goods to the fans. They played all of the classics that you want to hear, and they even mixed in some of their newer material, and it fits together pretty seamlessly. So I decided to pull this Blu-ray out of FILMAGE, the story of Descendents and All, another band that is an offshoot of the Descendents, and this covers their entire story. I'm a huge fan. I've been a giant fan of them since 1987. When I heard them for the very first time. So to me, they're kind of like the epitome of the 1980s because that was kind of like their strongest era and the era that they're most well known for. To me, the Descendents, their music, everything about them kind of plays out like a teen sex comedy put to music. I would say hearing this band actually in the 1980s for the very first time was like the icing on the cake. So I've got this shirt right here on. This 1986 legit vintage Descendents shirt from their Bonus Cup tour. And essentially, if you were a teen in the 1980s, particularly if you were not popular at school or you were some sort of nerd or geek, you could definitely relate to the Descendents lyrics. So I think that's why they really resonated with so many people. Now in the 1980s, I was really into skateboarding and into stuff like, the Circle Jerks and Black Flag and all of those bands at the time, a lot of the hardcore stuff out there. So I'll never forget the day that I actually heard the Descendents for the first time. It was that monumental for me because even though I loved punk rock at the time and all of the aggressive music that was coming out, I was into speed metal and stuff like that, like Metallica, there was still something missing. And it wasn't until 1987 when I heard the Descendents for the first time, particularly their album All. I remember skateboarding over to a friend's house with my buddy Tim at the time, who was a neighborhood friend of mine. We were skateboarding over there and this guy was going to give us a tape of the Descendents, which I had heard a lot of people talking about. They had recently played around town on tour. I was very curious to hear what they sounded like. And I remember going over to our friend's house and he gave us this cassette tape. Now, back in the day, nothing was on Spotify, nothing was on the internet, there was no internet. So back in 1987, he gave us a blank tape that he had recorded this album by this band on. And I remember on his front porch asking him, hey, so what do the Descendents sound like? And he gave me this insane explanation of what this band sounded like, and I'll never forget it. He told me it was like a mix between Whitney Houston and Metallica. So I was pretty perplexed at the time as to what the fuck that would sound like. I'll never forget when we skateboarded all the way home with this tape, went down into my older brother's room in the basement, went on his stereo system and threw this tape in, Descendents All, and it kicked in. And I heard the song Coolidge for the first time. And his description of what the Descendents sounded like kind of made sense in a weird way. Now, I wouldn't say that they sound like Whitney Houston or Metallica, but the basic idea was there because the Descendents were a lot different than any other punk band that I was hearing at the time. They were essentially, I think, the kings of pop punk, like modern pop punk. I would say that the Ramones probably invented the genre of pop punk, but the Descendents kind of went and perfected it. And I feel like a lot of bands that became really popular in the 1990s definitely stole or ripped off the Descendents sounds, like Blink-182, Green Day, all of those great bands, but they were heavily influenced by these guys. So the difference between a band like the Descendents and the Circle Jerks were that the Descendents had songs that were just as aggressive or more aggressive than a band like the Circle Jerks or Black Flag. And then the next song would be this sweet kind of love song about rejection, about high school, about parents. They had all these kind of melodic tunes, these like melodic anthems that really resonated with me as a teenager because they were writing these songs, in fact, when they were teens. So the band started out in the late 70s and continued on all the way through 1987. And a lot of these songs at the time, I felt that they were like written for me. That's a common thing that I hear fans of the Descendents say, is that they feel like they were writing songs about their life as teenagers. It was almost like they were looking through my window, on a school night and kind of looking into my mind and really feeling everything that I was going through as a teen. It was just the perfect soundtrack of going through puberty and turning into a pimply-faced teenager and trying to ask a girl out for the first time, getting rejected, fighting with your parents. all of this sort of stuff. And this band was writing like songs that were like anthems to me to this day. Every time I hear a song like Coolidge or Pep Talk or Get the Time or I Don't Want to Grow Up, it still strikes that chord with me, and it makes me feel this amazing amount of nostalgia, like particularly like 80s nostalgia. And a lot of these songs I feel like actually helped me get through some of the toughest times as a teenager. Now this band, even though I describe them as kind of sweet and aggressive at times, I'm going to say that they were a product of their time in the same way as you can watch like a sex comedy from the 80s, and some of that stuff really has not aged well because of how our culture has changed. And a lot of lyrics, even through like their 90s reunion album, Everything Sucks. You know, some of the stuff could be considered probably pretty offensive these days. So I would say that you can't really look at a lot of their music through the lens of today's culture. You have to kind of put yourself back into, say, you know, you're in the era of Pretty in Pink or The Breakfast Club or something like Revenge of the Nerds. That being said, the band has also changed a bit with the times, which I think is a good thing because they kind of realized that some of these lyrics definitely did not age well and aren't going to resonate with people now. And, you know, even though they've got one of their most famous songs, I Don't Want to Grow Up, they have grown up, not all the way though. And some of the songs, they've altered their lyrics a little bit, and some of the songs from their earlier albums, they just don't play at all. And I understand that, and I don't hold anything against them for that. There was a time and a place for some of that stuff. The band has aged gracefully because they're still doing shows and going strong in 2025 with the same 4 members that were in the band since 1986, and also putting out new records that are pretty good. So this documentary here, that's directed by Matt Riggle and Dieter LaCour, they do a fantastic job. Obviously, they're gigantic fans of the Descendents. They really put their heart and soul into this thing, and you can tell the way that this thing is presented, it is basically a flawless documentary. Now, in my opinion, I wish it had been a little bit longer because as a giant fan of the band, there were lots of stories and things that I had questions about. Now, luckily, FILMAGE has a pretty awesome special features selection on here that features 77 minutes of additional footage of like interviews with the band and band members and other people, so it goes a lot deeper. You can kind of get the bonus cut of the film. It essentially gives you another movie on this thing if you've got any more questions about the band. There's great interviews on here with like punk rock legends, commentary from people like Keith Morris from Circle Jerks and Black Flag. And I gotta mention that the drummer, Bill Stevenson, was actually the drummer of Black Flag. And he was hitting the skins for Black Flag, and I would say probably their most popular era of the band, which is the Henry Rollins era. So he's got a lot of punk rock credibility behind him as well, being the drummer of Black Flag during that era. And you can hear a lot of Black Flag's influence in the Descendents' music as well. Because unlike the Ramones, the Descendents were very technical. So, I mean, the Ramones were great players of their instruments and had amazing melody, but the Descendents, I would say, were kind of like far better musicians than the Ramones. Particularly Bill Stevenson is probably one of the best drummers in punk rock and maybe in rock and roll. He is absolutely fantastic, and he's also a fabulous songwriter. This is one of those bands where like every member wrote different songs for the band. So this kind of covers the entire history of the formation of the Descendents. Now this also covers the band All. So All is the band that formed after the Descendents broke up, meaning basically that their lead singer, Milo, who has this sort of iconic cartoon character, I guess his face would be kind of considered like the Crimson Ghost for the Misfits. We kind of see that all over the place. Now, he left the band to pursue a career, a very successful career, studying biochemistry and all of that stuff. So he had, you know, bigger aspirations than playing punk rock. So the band stayed together after he left, but they employed a new singer, this guy Dave Smalley, from a band called Dag Nasty, which I was a huge fan of back in the day too. Now, if you've never heard Dag Nasty before, you've got to check them out, especially if you're a fan of the Descendents. So it was almost like this super group at the time. I'm a huge fan of the original era, you know, the original formation of All. I never got to see them live. I saw the second and third incarnations of All very many times throughout the years, but I never was able to see the Dave Smalley era, which really bums me out, because their first 2 records with him are absolutely amazing. And they formed in 1988 and kind of kept this tradition going of the Descendents sound, only with a different singer. Now, a lot of people will say that both bands sound very different. I would say that you probably could switch the lead singer, Milo, of the Descendents with any of the singers from All on their records, and you would probably still end up with a fantastic Descendents album. Now, interestingly enough, at the time of recording this video, I believe this weekend in Canada, All is playing this Buddies Fest. I think it's in Toronto, and they are reforming and headlining for 2 nights. The first night was Scott Reynolds from the second incarnation of the band, which is kind of like the era of the band that has my favorite All record. So All Roy's Revenge, I would say, is the best All record. And then the second night of Buddies Fest, we've got Chad Price, who took over, I think in like 1993. He did 4 albums with the band. I love his stuff as well, but I'm particularly more inclined to be a bigger fan of the first 2 incarnations of All, which is the Dave Smalley era and the Scott Reynolds era. And I really wish that I could be at Buddies Fest right now for those 2 nights, because it would be like fucking nostalgia heaven. So Descendents disbanded in 1987. When I say disbanded, Milo left. And then in 1988, they reformed as All. So the last Descendents album was called All, and they decided to take that name and use it for the band. So from the late 80s through, I think, the early 2000s, they were keeping the tradition of All alive. And in the mid-90s, like 1996, they came back as the Descendents, because Milo got the itch to play again, and released, arguably, I would say, maybe their best album as the Descendents, Everything Sucks, which is an absolute classic. Now, Descendents did 2 albums after that. They did Cool to Be You in 2004 and Hypercaphium Spazzinate in 2016, which is still pretty strong record for the band, considering that a lot of time has passed, and it's probably a lot harder for them to write a really solid Descendents record when they're not teenagers anymore. So that would be my only complaint with hearing a new Descendents record, say like the last thing that they did in 2016, is that it's kind of missing some of the ingredients that I really love from the Descendents, which is mainly like love songs and songs of rejection and kind of those teen anthems. And I've got to mention that in 2021, they put out an album called Ninth and Walnut, which actually features the very original lineup of the Descendents. So they all recorded these songs from the late 70s and early 80s that were only demos at the time, that were never released. So Milo recorded the vocals, I believe, in like 2020. It's a pretty special and unique album because you're hearing all of these Lost Descendants songs. You really got that classic sound from Ninth and Walnut. So that was a unique release, though it's not by any means like a brand new release by the band, because all of them now are like happily married. And I think it's kind of hard to write those type of songs when you're in a really great, long-lasting relationship with kids. But back in the day, the Descendents and All kind of led me to discover a bunch of other bands that were very similar in style to them. They were kind of like kindred spirits with the Descendents. Now, most of these bands were on this record label called CRUZ Records, so I would say that this sound would be called the allular sound, meaning that a lot of these bands that I'm going to mention here really had a sort of similar vibe, and all of their albums being produced and recorded by Bill and Stefan from All and Descendents really gave them this kind of allular sound, especially in like the bass playing and some of the drumming, and of course the songs as well, having similar themes and kind of what the Descendents and All would play. So very allular. The Descendents' entire first run of 80s stuff was released on Greg Ginn from Black Flag's label, SST Records. And then in the late 80s, when All formed, he went on to put this new label out called CRUZ Records. CRUZ Records had these other bands on it that I instantly fell in love with that would tour with the Descendents. So bands like the Chemical People, one of my favorite bands of all time, Big Drill Car, who I got to see live many times. I got to see them play with All in, I think, 1990 or 1989. Basically had this trio of bands, All, Chemical People, and Big Drill Car. So if you like that sort of sound of the Descendents and All, you are bound to love these bands as well. It also led me to other bands like the Doughboys. So if you've never heard the Doughboys, they're also very influenced by the Descendents as well. In fact, the Doughboys, this Canadian pop punk band, when I say pop punk, I mean pop punk that could have went right alongside the Descendents seamlessly. They took them on tour in 1987 for their Fine All tour with Milo. So the Doughboys, if you've never heard of them before and you want to discover some stuff like very similar to the Descendents in that same kind of way where you get like punky love songs that are like pre-Blink-182 and pre-Green Day, check out the Doughboys from Canada. They will blow your fucking mind, especially their first 2 records, Whatever, and my favorite of all time, Home Again by the Doughboys, which was actually produced by Bill Stevenson and Stefan Egerton from the Descendents and All. So they actually produced the CRUZ Records band's albums as well, like Big Drill Car's albums. and also the Chemical People. And they also took both of them on tour with them. So yeah, I hold the Descendents and All dear to my heart, some of my favorite records of all time, as well as some of the records by the bands that I just mentioned. And also bands from that era too that were very influenced by the Descendents as well, like the Hard-ons from Australia. There's a ton of really good stuff out there of like late 80s, early 90s pop punk before the giant pop punk boom when they were signing everyone. And I always kind of wish that the Descendents at All would have gotten their day on the radio stations, because I could hear these bands that were so popular like Blink-182 and Green Day all being so influenced. But I'm happy to say that the Descendents nowadays are fucking selling out venues. They're playing huge festivals. They've been going strong since I think about 2008 when they reformed again. So you'll get the full story on that on this Blu-ray as well. You get the whole story of them as teenagers throughout the 80s, how they formed the band. You get the whole scoop on Milo leaving the band and how disappointed they were, and then how they continued on as All. And they never were able to, garner that respect that the Descendents did because they were so damn iconic. So very interesting, really fucking well done documentary. It's of course got people like Dave Grohl on it as well. It seems like Dave Grohl is in like every fucking punk documentary, to the point that I'm kind of getting sick of hearing him talk about this shit. I mean, I could watch a rockumentary on like the Backstreet Boys, and if it's well done enough, I will be intrigued the entire time and I will be there for it. So I love hearing about how bands form and the band drama that they were in, because I can relate to it as well. And in fact, I was in several bands in the 90s that were heavily influenced by the Descendents and All. In particular, one of my bands called Ben Grimm. Now you can check out, I'll put the link to the full Ben Grimm album here so you can actually hear what I'm talking about. But we were giant fans of Descendents and All, and I myself just worshipped the bass player of the Descendents and All, Carl Alvarez. One of my favorite musicians of all time, my favorite bass player of all time. His bass playing is absolutely fantastic. I really tried to kind of emulate him and rip him off when I was in my old band. You can check that out right here. So I just highly recommend FILMAGE. I just had to give this a review and give props to some of the bands that I love that were also influenced by the Descendents. But if you've never seen this, check this shit out. You can grab FILMAGE on Blu-ray. And I believe that Lunchmeat VHS also put that thing out on VHS, which is pretty awesome. So if you want that ultimate kind of like 80s nostalgic feeling, check out that VHS. I don't know how hard to find the copies are of that. I'm really happy that Lunchmeat put that thing out. All right, so that's it for me today. Let me know what you think of the Descendents or All, or any of the bands I mentioned, or if you've seen this documentary. Let me know in the comments what you think. All right, I will see you next time.